and and foods that are considered acceptable to eat, things that are corrupting, those ideas of purity, and basically what we want to take into ourselves, and as a metaphor for kinship and sexuality, but also kind of as a real, physical thing that we're dealing with all the time. And to show you how important some foods are, I think that chapter from the cooking technology book about these Amazonians who are in urban environments, and what do? They make their cassava bread. And for those of you, has anybody ever had, to your knowledge, cassava or manioc? Anybody in here know? A really common food? Maybe sort of common? How many people have had tapioca pudding? You've all had cassava. That's what it's made from. So manioc, actually, so this is what it's a root crop. And it's one of the first foods, in fact, that Columbus describes. And he's really fascinated by, because he's calling it bread, and thinking of wheat bread, but it's this very thing that that one chapter talks about. And the thing about,
Wait, so the tapioca part is the cassava?
Yeah, it's made from cassava. It's another way of processing it. Why isn't this going? Come on. There we go. And the thing about manioc, cassava, is it actually has, I'm blanking on it's got a poison to it. And so you have to process it properly. Now I know. See the root and how he's scraping it? Okay. Oh, it's just very quiet. Hang on, I'm gonna get the sound up so we can hear. What? That's because of that. Sorry. Yeah.
And we are here in what is called the Kathryn Sampeck, the house where the mandioc flour is made. It's a very typical, authentic place where people once a month, once every 2 weeks gather with all their neighbors to make their own flour. Roberto is the owner, and he's going to explain.
So this is in Brazil.
We bring it here, and then we're going to raspar. So after peeling.
Have you peeled a sweet potato before? That's kind of weird. Like it's.
There's like one part.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a sharp one. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn the sound up because it's just really, I don't know why it's so super quiet.
And here will be processed before it goes to the press.
Here on this thing?
On the desk.
Oh, on the desk?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's what the.
After being processed, the mandioc, you will see that it is a rather wet suspension, very liquid, and you must know that the liquid within here is very poisoning.
Yeah.
You can't eat it.
Right. It's inedible.
So you have to separate the material, the materia, from the liquid. And that will be done in this press. It is a very old press, very authentic. It must have at least 100 years old, or even more. But it works very well.
So you have to get the juice out of it because, yeah, it has. You know what? I'll look it up here while that's going.
Is it like a flour texture?
Yeah, it's gonna make into a flour, but one version of it, like the coarser, grainier version of it, is tapioca. That's exactly what tapioca is. Cassava.
Is tapioca made from the sweeter version of
Yeah,
cassava? That's
yeah,
what-
because this is very bitter and it's sort of like more starchy. Cyanide. It has cyanide in it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, that's what I was saying. Is a poison. Totally serious about that. Yeah, and the seeds, but very tiny amounts. This is like you eat a spoonful. Yeah, you're gonna get sick. It might not
Once
necessarily
the
kill you off.
flour is separated from
So
the
it takes a lot of
poisoning liquid, it goes over here for sifting. And after sifting, it goes to directly to the oven. And only when it is a very nice, fine, sifted flour, it can go to the oven.
Yeah. So it's really important to grate it, get that juice out, let it dry, and that sort of thing. And it has to be sort of physically mashed to get the stuff out of it. Potatoes are the same way. I mean, they're poisonous too.
So it's like tapioca and stuff that they put in like herbal tea.
Yeah, totally.
So how do
So
they-
all of y'all have had cassava probably.
My wife,
Okay.
41, was a small.
The colors, I'm not sure about the process. There are different kinds of cassava, and that's the process.
Exactly the same.
But anyway, you get the idea that there's a sort of toasted flour that they make from it, and that's described in that one chapter. And then the bread that they make from it, from the flour and the processed cassava.
As we saw inside, there are two ovens in order to toast the more or less wet flour. And one of the first things people do when they start with the whole process is make the fire, get the oven, heat it up, so that on the end of the day they are going to toast it, and after toasting it, eat a little benchou.
Yeah. And that's what it, that's what it looks like.
Seems like it shouldn't stick together. They toast it and they dry it out a little bit.
Uh-huh.
They get to manage to actually
Yeah,
make
it is,
pattern.
basically. It's a lot like a pancake. Okay, we don't want that anymore. Okay, so, yeah. And so some of you in your posts were really kind of reflecting on these things that seem like accidental discoveries. I mean, something that has poison in it. How did they figure out to process it this way would get rid of that and make it edible? And this is a staple food. So I think that chapter is really good at emphasizing for these Amazonians, even going into urban environments where you could acquire other kinds of food. This is seen as a healthy, satisfying, nourishing food, and the other stuff that is around and much more available. I mean, you have to go to a lot of trouble to make this and to do this. And so I think any of our food choices involve, we make these arguments of economic efficiency. I think those are just comforting stories we tell ourselves. And a lot of the things we do involve a lot of trouble for a lot of people. And it depends on the kinds of choices that we're making about things. Okay, so I want to be sure and cover that. So, yeah. Uh-huh.
Is cassava supposed to be sweet, or is it just?
It can be. There are different varieties, and there's a bitter, and this is the bitter that they're processing there, and that they make the bread out of. It's not after they process it; it's more just sort of starchy, but there is a sweet one too. Yeah, and so it seems like somebody was writing about sweet potatoes in Southeast Asia. Yeah, and so these are sort of cousins. In some ways, yeah. Okay. So now if we move on to thinking about, and especially, why go to all that trouble? Why spend all that time bringing that food with you to another environment? Part of that is that, you can go back to Mary Douglas and think of, well, this is not just symbolic, but it's actually of the place that I'm from. This is keeping it in my family. I'm eating the things that are wholesome and from a familiar place. Which then we can take those sorts of ideas and think about cacao and chocolate history, because as I explained earlier, and that was one thing that came through in your post, and I'm still, it's a great learning tool for me, because I'm still not getting my message quite across. On the one hand, you have definitely elite use of cacao and those fancy vessels for the cacao beverages, but those steep spouted pots and a lot of that early evidence, some of it's from special tombs, a lot of it's from just all over the place. And the almanacs, the painted books that I showed of the deities doing, those are daily almanacs. They're for common people. So cacao wasn't just an elite thing. There were elite uses of it. But you could do the same thing with wheat or with corn or any of those sorts of things. There were elite ways that people, did stuff with it. But a lot of those rituals are everyday rituals. They're marriages. Everybody gets married. You have these unions. That's how you keep your population going. You have that sort of daily, everyday sort of consumption is really the kind of thing that I'm interested in. And chocolate becomes that in these really funny ways. And we sort of romanticize it as it being very elite and restricted, but how hard is it to get chocolate today? Not too hard. It's in a lot of stuff that we maybe wouldn't even want it there. Looking at cacao and looking across the uses of cacao and with colonial encounters, especially in colonial period, what happens is that cacao and sugar become very strongly associated, as we tasted last time, right? So let's look at that a little bit. And for this work, I'm going to introduce you to another great anthropologist who died last year. And sadly, I never got to meet him. A friend of mine was asking, did you meet him? And I never managed to. I met other colleagues of his. But Sidney Mintz did a lot of different kinds of interesting anthropological work. Worked in the Caribbean especially. But what he became known for was this book that he wrote about, it's called Sweetness and Power. And he looks at sugar, and he looks at sugar history, and looks at sugar particularly in the case of England. And he thought it had a very special sort of history. And what he really wanted to do was look at how the symbolic associations, the way the substance was used, the way it was thought of, and the way it was produced, how all of those change over time and how that seems to fit together. So it's all these sorts of things, the character of its uses and the ways it was perceived, and especially symbolism. What do you associate with sugar? Off the top of your head? Candy.
Sweetness.
Sweetness, yeah. Just sweet. If I call you sugar, what does that mean? It means he's a terrible person, right? What does it mean? Let's go beyond other words.
Good.
Good. Right. It's a moral thing, isn't it? It's good. Is sugar ever, sweetness ever associated with being bad?
Is that dentistry perspective?
Yeah, but it took a long time for dentists not to give out lollipops. My dad said, I'm from a family of dentists, so yeah.
I would say just in the way that like it's over sweetness,
Ah.
like intertwined with promiscuity, which is like goes along with the sugar.
Yeah, sweetness, there's a certain, you can be overindulgent, right? It can be too sweet. If it's too sweet, it's sort of not believable, right? Yeah.
Oh, I would also say, oh my God, I was like, too much sugar.
Oh yeah, and there's some things, I almost put that in this talk. I'll come back to it, I'm sure, at a different point, because it was going to be just like too much to try to cram into one class. But there are these interesting things, and like a scandal that's just come out lately too about guidelines about sugar versus fat, and diabetes again, that sort of, and I'll fold it in at another point. Because I wanted to get, there's another issue I want to concentrate on today. So, we do our thing. We think about, well, where was it first grown? And I mentioned this earlier on, but India especially was a main center of early agriculture of sugar. And then especially it moves out with Muslim populations into these regions, and then pretty late into Europe. And the growing areas in Europe tend to be the Canary Islands, are the first major area that it's grown. And so it's fairly small quantities, and it's part of this sort of growing commerce between Asia and across to Europe, and especially through these Arab traders. Comes into play in lots of other ways too. This whole network of all sorts of commodities, and sugar's one of them, and it's these spices, right? Somebody's writing about pepper, black pepper. This is, a lot of this is the peppers getting involved in this, and other sorts of spices. And comparing, what are sources of sweetness? Oh yeah, there's a bit of an question, how much of it is sort of the biology of our nature that we like or crave sweet. What do you think about that? Yeah.
I definitely think it's can be a natural thing, because the term sweet tooth implies that it's your tooth wanting it.
Yeah.
Your body's
So it's part of your body.
Yeah.
Body craving.
I don't know the exact facts, but there's speculation that there's this certain type of sugar addiction,
Mm-hmm.
because sugar is brain in the same way that knows or something like that.
Yeah, endorphins.
Yeah,
It
endorphins.
stimulates endorphin production, which cacao does also too. So yeah, it stimulates the pleasure center.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And then your brain tricks you into thinking even more and more of it, and that's where the addiction part comes.
Yeah. And in fact, with infants, you can't give them certain kinds of anesthetics, and so there's basically kind of a sugar treatment that they coat their mouth with sugar and that sort of thing, and it'll help with pain, relieving pain. And so some of this medicinal use is not crazy, it's not totally made up. And it's something that's actually part of medical practice today. So it has definitely biological effects, and it also gives you a lot of energy. It can be very sort of straightforward source of energy. And then you can think about the tasting, your ability to taste, and what are the flavors that we actually taste with our tongue. most of our taste comes through smell. Like all the subtleties, or it's actually smell. But sweet is one of the ones that we actually do taste. We have taste buds that receive that.
Is sugar similar to lake salt? Because they've done studies that if you're craving salty things, then your body is missing these nutrients.
Yeah.
You know, does sugar have kind of the same?
Craving sugar, I'm not sure. Maybe, interesting thing. I'm trying to think of people's different projects. Fold that into it. Because sugar cravings tend to be more associated with this sort of addictive behavior like she was talking about that come to my mind. I'm sure there's studies. Sweetness, though, comes in lots of forms, right? And honey is a main one, and that one as far as from a European perspective, and also, somebody was doing honey, working on honey, and I forgot to put in the notes that the Maya domesticated stingless bees. If you're domesticating a bee, it's because you're interested in the honey. They're not eating the bee. And so that it's cross-culturally a very common sort of sweetener. Fruits, right? And what sugars can do is also act as preservatives. You've probably heard of honey-cured ham. That's the easiest one. Jams and jellies are basically ways to preserve fruit in sugar. And then there are treatments with honey that, sore throats and that sort of thing. There actually is, there's some beneficial elements to that. The thing about honey, though, is that there's not a lot of processing needed to get the sweet stuff, right? It's either there or it isn't. The bees make it. And nowadays with honey, there's pasteurizing and other sorts of things that go on, but it's not to make the honey. Whereas sugar, to extract it from whatever source you're using, requires a processing that's kind of like that cassava that we just saw. There's a certain amount of grinding or extracting the juice and that sort of thing that we'll see. So, more trouble with sugar, right? And we see as sugar comes into Europe that it's used in all these different ways that I was talking about, as sort of a seasoning, so a condiment, something you'd serve on the side, a little bit of sugar you could put on your food, to preserve things, to cure things. And there are a lot of treatments. Now, this sort of comment about masking a bitter taste, yeah, to a certain extent, but really what it seems to be doing in a lot of these early sort of medical treatises is the sugar itself is seen as having particular healing properties. Are any of y'all familiar with these sort of medieval ideas about health, how they thought what the body was made up of and how you kept healthy? I took that slide out of this one. It's humoral theory. Have you heard of that? Yeah, black. So basically they thought the body was composed of 4 major fluids, humors. Yeah, black bile, yellow bile, blood, phlegm, So, and those all had color associations, and they had things that were associated by heat versus, things that were cold, things that were hot. And the way you kept healthy was by balancing all of that. So, I think in some ways our ethics of balance sort of still have those humoral roots to them. And so they saw very particular properties that you would combine sugar with this other thing that had a different humoral quality to make the treatment that the person needed to restore their health. And then there's the caloric value too. So as early as the 13th century, this is all, this is a long heritage of sweetness in Europe in general. And I've got a couple of examples. This one goes into these medieval recipes. These are those same illustrations. Take honey and roots of radish and grind it small in a mortar. Can y'all read this? And do put honey and a quantity of brown sugar. So, honey, radish, grind it up, honey and brown sugar. It's not sweet, like really sweet radish.
Probably really nasty. Radish is nasty.
Well, so if you start from there, there's probably nothing you could do to radishes to make it tastier. I actually had this sort of taco kind of thing that had radishes and peaches in it. It was great.
What was that supposed to be for?
This treatment, this curry on English. I'm not sure what this is supposed to be treating, and we just have this snippet of it too. And then you take pepper and saffron and almonds and do all together. That's what this is saying. Boil long enough and held on a wet board, and keel is, and mess it and do it forth. And so you're basically making, you're boiling it down in all of this sugar and honey and pepper and saffron. Really?
It's so weird because saffron is so strong.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, so you get an idea of how pungent these things are. This is Delights for Ladies. So make a sugar paste, carve it into molds, take white refined, double refined sugar, if you can get it. So that was the issue. There were different kinds of sugars. They described, black sugars, all these different colors, and let's see, what else do you have to do? And yeah, this is just dealing with powdered sugar. And then there's some things with flour and eggs. And this would be more of a custard. I can't remember who's doing custards either, but this is a 13th century example of custard. Okay, so it's in cookbooks, it's sort of medical books, cookbooks. Here's a little thing about from a BBC broadcast that talks about, actually this is very, I'll get to that in a second. This is great because these are sugar producing sites. This one in Israel, again, 12th, 13th century. And this is a pot that's from this, it's a sugar production pot. It's part of the boiling process that I'll show you in a minute. So this is in Israel, so that Middle Eastern production. And here we go. No, this is another, another production site. Okay, there's a video in the next one now. And you see, again, remember, lots of processing. This is a pretty big space. These are the different areas of boiling and separating the sugar cane and getting the cane juice and cooking it into making sugar. And these are what the pots look like. This is a really nice example for that. Here's a medieval drawing, 14th century. Here's also some other medieval drawings, illustrations. This isn't, but where they're refining it and making it into these cakes. So they're different kinds. But basically, it has to be boiled several times, and these are part of the pots for making that. And I found those kind of things archaeologically too. They don't change a lot. So this is 1300s, and 200 years later, the pots are almost exactly that same shape, and you find other pots that are this shape in Guam, in El Salvador, in Spain. Okay. So early uses, like I mentioned, you can extract sugar from a lot of different kinds of plants. And what's the evil one today? What's the evil sugar that nobody, they label it?
Corn syrup.
Yeah, no high fructose. Yeah, it's from corn. And now they're going back to emphasizing cane sugar. And then sugar beets are something that comes into play in the global market much later than cane sugar. Doesn't quite overwhelm. It becomes very important in Europe, particularly. Anybody been around sugarcane? Ever seen it growing? So, it's a tall tropical grass, basically. And any of you have in gardens that you've been around, those really tall ornamental grasses, like any of the huge ones, and they'll have really sharp edges to them, right? Same here. I mean, yeah, exactly. And so when you work in sugarcane, even if it's blazing hot, ideally, you're going to get cut if you don't protect yourself, because the edges of the leaves are so sharp. And it's actually very beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful, tall, the sugarcane fields are really something to see, especially when they're blossoming like this, because the blossoms are sort of silvery and shine in the light and with the breeze and everything. But what you want, where the sugar comes from, is from the main stem of the plant itself.
Is sugar similar to like bamboo, and that's a very high reproducible plant?
Yeah,
Very sustainable.
yeah, it's stable. Like most sugarcane plantings will last for several years. They don't propagate on their own like bamboo does, not as easily. And because they have to replace the plants periodically, whereas bamboo, you can just go to town. So, you can imagine, you harvest the sugarcane when it's big and full, and so it's not the most pleasant kind of thing. And many areas in Latin America, they burn the leaves off. And so there's this period when the safra starts, and it's basically a rain of ash. You think it's been a volcanic explosion or something, but you just have this tile fall that makes everything black. It's this black stuff that's falling everywhere. And you can imagine for the workers themselves, a lot of breathing problems from the smoke and all that. Yeah.
Right. So the leaves are on the the stem of the thing is where you get the sugar.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the
if you're
stem.
burning the leaves, wouldn't they be worried about burning the whole plant?
It's hard. It's tough. So it doesn't burn the stalk. The leaves burn off really quickly. And by the time that it's ready to harvest, those leaves are a little bit dead. And so it just burns that off, and then the stalk is left there, and then you just cut the stalk down. A lot of places don't do that, but it, parts of Mexico, Central America. So you have the agricultural labor, which is hard in itself. And then the thing about sugar is that once you cut it, the amount of sugar in that goes down. It starts to decrease the longer the cane sits there. And so what you have to do is take that sugar cane into the processing area as soon as possible. So once you have, that means for the labor, it becomes a 24-hour job. That once the harvest starts and you're cutting that field, you've got to get it in and you've got to do at least the first stage of processing. And it, nothing else matters, because basically you're losing sugar the longer it sits there. And so there's the work of getting the cane to the place. And then the way it's processed, there are larger and smaller scales, but it's basically a very centralized, because you got to squeeze the juice out of that cane. Not an easy thing to do kind of on your own. So none of you all have had sugar cane, like just had a bite of it? Gee, I wonder, they don't carry, I don't think they carry it in any of the, like the grocery stores here. If we're in Chicago, I can get some probably. Because Latin America, you know, especially, it'll be kind of a snack, but it's really fibrous. So it's like a terrible snack because it's sugar and then it grinds the enamel off your teeth because it's so, you know, it's like crunchy and fibrous. Yeah.
They might have it at Pepitas on Market Street.
Oh yeah,
By
really?
the DMV kind of.
Uh-huh.
It's a Latin American dish.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look for that. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
They have like a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they have a lot of the like the little onions and all the pipián. Yeah, I'll look for it because it, you know. So if you take a bite or two, it's not going to ruin your teeth immediately. But like growing up and having a habit of eating it, you just end up with terrible teeth. And it's not just the sugar; it's the cane itself. And so that cane is tough. You know, it survives being burned. So it's a matter of processing it, and what processes it well is machinery of some kind.
Put sugar on a toothbrush and well.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's like having sugar on sandpaper more like.
Yeah.
You know?
Then why do they continue to eat it?
Oh no, it's fun. I mean, it's crunchy. It's crunchy and sweet, but you don't think about it, you know, grinding away your enamel because it's crunchy and sweet. Oh. We do a lot of stuff that's bad for us all the time.
Why do we eat pizza? It's bad for you.
Yeah, but it's so good. It's so bad. It's so good. Here's a little, like a small scale example of how to make like the initial processing of brown sugar. Okay, while we're talking about sugar, I'm going to pass around the samples. I didn't want to wait till the very end to do. Yeah. So take one of these. This is in Colombia. Machinery. Always. So there's the cane going into.
Igual, pues un trapiche tradicional,
This is
un trapiche que tiene muchos años.
traditional
Lo que llega
tradition.
aquí y se pasa por este molino.
You put the cane in there. It's got just like really long ends. And wait, you
Pasa el
have,
guarapo, se deposita en esa tina y ahí la subimos como toronja. Allá está.
and it passes through a pump and it reaches there. The juice basically over one way. And they're burning the bagazo, the pulp that's left over. A lot of places will use that as
Venía
fodder for
contando,
cattle.
el guarapo es por
Smells
motor,
like-
llega aquí a este tanque. Esto demora un periodo más o menos de media hora para limpiar el guarapo.
Yeah.
Y ahí
Yeah,
ya
all
va,
this smells
pues,
terrible.
They use
este
it for
tubo.
what?
Fertilizer to feed cattle.
En cada medida que va consumiendo el agua
Cattle
va
will feed the
pasando
pulp. That.
de fondo a fondo.
And so see how he's cooking it? You gotta
Hasta
do
que
a lot
llega
of cooking
aquí,
and at the right
que es donde al
temperature.
punto.
Pues mira, para acá el punto de eso, pues se utiliza un termómetro. Pero como
And
no
he's
lo
talking
hay,
about the temperature
como
that
tradicionalmente
these are
meter el
cooked
dedito
at.
en el agua y sacar aquí un poquitico y ya ponerle punto aquí.
Yeah,
Ya lo
and
que
he's
esté
testing
bien
it.
duro,
It's gonna be
como ves
burnt.
aquí, ya se saca, como mira,
And then it's
funciona.
ready.
Ya está bañado. Ya se saca ahí el cajón.
So now they're gonna put it into that. And basically, so the whole process is extracting water from it.
El objetivo de nosotros siempre es ese, ¿no?
And now
Producir
this
una panela de
is what they call panela, which is like brown sugar.
Nada de químicos, nada de eso. Lo que yo no quiero para mí, no quiero para los demás.
And he's talking about it doesn't have any chemicals in it.
Una panela de buena calidad, para mí. Tengo mi conciencia tranquila. Que no estoy pendiente. Algo que
Yeah,
usar para la...
and that's almost that's a very common way to get sugar, and throughout Latin America you
A
see
pesar de
it
que
in markets like
actualmente no es algo
that. And this
rentable
is
nada de
the
eso.
main way that it was
Trabajar porque es lo único que le
sold
da comida a uno.
in a lot of
Y lo importante es
throughout the
tener uno,
colonies.
So
Yeah.
how did they,
la comidita.
wait, so it
Y
comes
eso sustenta a nosotros.
Yeah.
hard ball?
Porque
Uh-huh.
actualmente
Yeah,
no
after,
hay nada
it's
más.
been, after the cane juice has been cooked, boiled down.
And then they take like extra like steps to make it into powder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wait, so that's like brown sugar, like white, you have to like pack it, but how do they make just like the regular white?
The white sugar.
It goes dry.
Yeah, it's basically processed more and more. It's cooked more, distilled more, and the thing is, you know, you have all of this. Okay, first, so sugar cane is brought in from Europe to the Americas, and this sort of processing is already known, like doing that basic kind of processing. Here's another, dang it, there's, I keep wanting to show this video, and I'm not sure where I embedded it. So you have the cane being brought in, it has to be boiled, you have to have skills and knowledge to judge each stage of making it and getting it finally to at least that sort of brown cake stage, the brown sugar stage. The liquid that comes off of that still has, you know, some sugars and stuff in it. It has a lot of flavor, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna mention, but I wanted to wait in case like you weren't gonna mention like rum, but I went to Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Bacardi was first created.
Yeah.
And they mentioned like a lot of sugar and like sugar cane.
Yeah. And so, you know, I think you've got to look. So this is a little bit like my dilemmas of food versus drinks in last class, and we tend to want to separate them out. But here you've got something that's being produced that eventually becomes a main source of calories for a lot of people, for us today, right? The food part, the sugar part. But in many ways, the production of rum was far more important, you know, coming out of that sugar cane than the sugar itself. The rum becomes the sort of main staple. It's provisions for sailors, for people in the military, and for the people who are growing and harvesting and processing the sugar cane. These are main provisions, and like all different levels of society too are consuming rum. Particularly for the British and Dutch colonies, and to a certain degree, the Spanish are holding on to wine. So as far as drinking lots and lots of rum, they do less of that compared to the British and Dutch areas, and a lot of illegal commerce going on because of rum. You know, Caribbean rum going to the British colonies and what becomes the United States, not supposed to be happening. All of this sort of thing going on. And it's, you know, so what are these factories, what is all this production being done for? It's an easy setup for both. I mean, you're producing sugar, you're producing rum, all at the same time. You hardly ever see just one thing going on. And this is a little video about how, it's broken. Okay, so we'll skip that right now. I'll try to find a new one that works. So, that transition, all of that flow of food, new products and so forth that's being shown here, things coming over this way, pumpkin, squash, turkeys, peanuts, corn going into Europe and Africa, sugarcane, grapes, that sort of thing coming in here. That exchange means that you've got to have people producing those things, doing the agriculture, processing this stuff, and making it. And this is where the history of cacao and sugar are very much the same, and not sweet at all. Because it's the environment where the people producing it are enslaved. It fuels rather than, just foods going back and forth. It's really this commerce in people and particular products that are fueling this exchange across the Atlantic in these ways. So, and this is a great link right here to look at different elements of the transatlantic slave trade. And this has databases that you can look at particular trips, look at the people who were involved in it, and estimates. But the basic information is that almost 13 million people from 1501, the very first, not sure about that, through 1867. So this network, and it shifts. I mean, it's a fairly long span. It shifts exactly which area in Africa that populations are coming from. And where do you think most of them went? Yeah, not even. So Latin America in general. Latin America is the hog in all of this. I mean, Brazil. So once these plantations really get going, and then particularly once the emphasis shifts to sugar production on plantations, it just eats people up. And there's expanding production that's driving part of the increased trade and enslaved people, but it's also just the way that the work was managed and the expectations that people could be replaced. So one thing that I'm working on is a very, very early slave trade and looking at the first enslaved people that come to the Americas and what kind of context that's in. And so this is 1550s-ish is some of the first ones. And particularly how it gets focused on, the history of African enslavement and European and African enslavement before that period, and then how it translates into the Americas and gives rise to this. And so at the very beginning, there's not necessarily a strong definition of you're enslaved for life. Every slave comes from Africa. Every slave is black. No. It's very much more variable. A lot of these people who come over, some are free Africans who come across to the Americas and are skilled artisans, and so it's a very complex development that eventually leads to southern U.S. plantation slavery. And a lot of that happens. It's really interesting in Latin America, the kinds of developments that happen there. But incredible mortality rates, very, very low fertility rates for people. And these are families that, and they're bringing women, men, children, different ages, and and just ripping things apart. And just this passage across here was so difficult that they expected a certain amount of loss. Yeah.
Have you talked to Soderlund about any of this?
Hmm?
You ever talked to Professor Soderlund about any of this?
No, not specifically, because this is something that's really like in the this last year, I've really gotten into this because cacao also leads inevitably into enslaved labor.
Yeah, I talked to him. He's a pretty big focus on the land
Yeah, yeah. I'm a little bit odd because I'm at the very beginnings. Like I want those first 10 years or so. That's what's really got me going, because that's when all of the cacao stuff starts. So where are these people coming from? Africa was a very complex and dynamic area of different sorts of political organizations, different warring factions, long history of interaction. Like they're interacting with those Arab traders just as much as the British or anybody in Europe is. And so you have Chinese porcelain showing up in the 12th, 13th century in different parts of Africa, northern Africa mostly. But all of these different groups, and very, a long history of Christianity in the Congo. So the slaves coming over from the Congo are already Catholic, and so it creates all of these interesting dynamics of citizenship, and who can be a citizen, and what does it mean to be enslaved, and how does that carry out over a person's life. Okay, so lots of different areas, and partly it has to do with Portuguese and Spanish interactions and who has permission, sort of the political power, and a lot of this is controlled by the Portuguese for a very long time. And they're really concentrating on the coastal area. And so they founded towns and ports, really, because it's just an extractive sort of relationship. And what they're relying on to get these people and other goods, so you have our people farther inland in these major centers and the different political powers and the dynamics, like Timbuktu is an example, fairly far inland in what's today Mali, large populous city with all of these political machinations that they're going through. And so part of that becomes taking people captive, and then that becomes part of commerce and other sorts of things, gold and spices and other sorts of resources that people are interested in. And so you have these trading caravans that carry lots of goods and people as well, very, very long distances. And once the Portuguese get into that, it builds on itself, I guess is one way to put it. And it increases warfare among those different polities that I was showing you, the different political groups. They go all sorts of different directions. And I can't possibly do it justice in like 20 minutes of a talk. But there's some really, if you're interested, I can give you a whole bunch of readings of different sorts of sources that take different perspectives on it. And then I'll do a little advertisement for next semester. I'm going to teach Afro-Latin America. So we'll be looking at these roots and then the dynamics, through today in Latin America particularly. One example of the port, this is the entrance to the building. It's called Elmina Castle in what is today Ghana. Was founded by the Portuguese. There was a settlement fairly near it, and then it eventually, over 150 years, grew to a settlement of 10,000 or so people. And this is a major port where a lot of the slaves came through. They were captive and then pushed out onto the boats. And this is what's called the door of no return. And what is all of this? Where is all this sugar going, and how is this developing? Well, you have this coerced labor producing more and more and more sugar, which makes it more and more accessible to more and more people, right? Fueling that Atlantic trade network. At first, 1700, it's sweetening these different stimulants, and chocolate's one of them. You start to see more of a connection, a more consistent connection of sweetness with cacao and preparation. Definitely sweetening tea and sweetening coffee as well. And Marshall Solons, who also, another anthropologist who was colleagues with Sidney Metz, was really thinking about, for Europeans, and somebody mentioned it last time, you take the sweet and it masks the bitter. And I think I'd like to step back to Mary Douglas and think about those sorts of social relations. It's, we're taking the sweet to mask the bitter, very bitter history, very difficult sorts of relationships that is producing all of this. It's not that no one knew where this was coming from or the human cost that was involved. And then there's a shift that Metz particularly emphasizes with industrialization. Well, what does that mean for a large body of people? It's much harder to make food at home, to cook food. It's the beginning. He sees sugar as the first sort of convenience food, like the first fast food in a way. And it is. And it's the basis of a lot of our fast foods too. And how does he see that happening? Well, instead of long, slow cooking sorts of gruels that made from barley and other sorts of grains, there's a shift to what? Wheat bread, because you can have a baker who makes the wheat bread, you go to the store, you buy the bread, and there it is, it's done. You're not even making it. And what do you put on that bread to make it a meal? You can put basically a little bit of fruit and a lot of sugar. You make jams and marmalades and things like that. You've got a meal. And then what do you have with that to really make it a meal? For, somebody working in a British, something to drink? For people working in British factories? Tea that's sweetened with a little sugar. So you see, that's where you have this sort of increasing emphasis on sugar as a main source of calories a while ago. And a lot of it, he argues, is this radical change and from working on a farm and direct sort of production of your own food and that sort of thing to having to work in a factory and selling your labor. And what are you doing? You're buying your food and you're basically buying sugar. And you're buying the labor of people very far away from you. The stuff that's being produced somewhere else. And so he sees that when you have it, he argues that when you have a major change in consuming, like a big increase in sugar in the diet, it's linked to something very fundamental about the economy and about political relations and about particularly social inequalities. That's his argument. Cacao is a funny thing within all of that, because you have the chocolate that's starting to be produced and more accessible and definitely sweetened. The way cacao is being produced across the same time period is also a shift very much from being under indigenous control in the 1500s and into the 1600s to enslaved labor in other places. Like they grow it, they start to grow it in places in large quantities where it was never grown in large quantities before. Ecuador, not so much Brazil, Venezuela particularly. And then by the 19th century, where does it go? To Africa. And that's where the majority of industrial chocolate is being produced today, very, very large quantities in Africa. And in fact, some of the latest cases of enslavement is in Africa, in these cocoa farms in Africa, like very completely illegal, absolutely slave labor.
Oh, I thought like the cocoa plant was like completely about it.
Yeah, but this is all in a tropical area. So, and sugar also is grown in pretty much in a tropical zone. I think coffee actually has much more cold tolerance than either of those two plants. And so you can have it move across, you can have it move from tropical Latin America to tropical Africa to tropical Asia. You know, you have that. And there's some people working on looking at the genesis of the plantation economy and how it really becomes like figured out in the Caribbean, and then it's exported to other parts of the world after emancipation in most places, but the effect is very much the same. Okay, so we better do our tasting because the time's up. Do you remember which is which? The one that has a little bit of decoration on it is the yeah. Okay, so let's taste the one that has sugar. We're going to go from the familiar to the less familiar. So the one with sugar is the one that has a little bit of a decoration on the imprinted on it. It's Maru chocolate from, and it's Vietnamese cacao. Okay, so taste that. And tell me what, but the thing about the Vietnamese cacao is it's a little unusual. So what sort of flavors are you tasting? First of all, what's the texture like? Really smooth. What sort of flavors are you getting?
It's not really fruity. It's like more light. It's not really fruity.
Yeah, not fruity. Good.
Kind of like your coffee.
Coffee, absolutely. You know, anything else? I should taste one. Remind myself. What else do you?
It's a little more rich, less floral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Great. Okay. Now, this one has no sugar in it whatsoever, but it's sweetened. So this is another kind of sweetness, and it's from this yacon root, and so it's like an alternative to sugar. So try that. This is Rocca chocolate, and let's see what's the origin of the Belize. So this is, and these are about the same amount, the same percentage of cacao in them. What do you get from it?
It's a little drier. It's kind of like
Mhm.
sour.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It tastes like more fruit.
Hmm?
It tastes more like fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely earthy. That kind of umami, earthy.
Is it sweet with honey?
No, it's just yacon root. So it's no cane sugar, no. So the sweetness that you get,
It's better than the other ones that we have.
the chocolate liquor, yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, that
What was the sweetener?
yacon. It's yacon root, and it's an Amazonian root. Okay. Thank you.